On June 15, 1944, Winston Churchill and Dwight D. Eisenhower convened in secret to deploy George S. Patton as the ultimate piece of psychological bait, a move that would rewrite the rules of modern military deception. This high-stakes gamble transformed a flamboyant general into a silent shadow, forcing the German high command to gamble their entire Western defense on a man who was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere at once. The atmosphere in London during the summer of 1944 was thick with the scent of ozone and the crushing weight of responsibility, as the initial triumph of the Normandy landings began to curdle into a grinding war of attrition in the treacherous hedgerows of France. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, shouldered the impossible burden of maintaining a crumbling timeline, while Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, sought a masterstroke that would break the stalemate without spilling more British and American blood than necessary. Their eyes were fixed on a map of the Pas-de-Calais, a stretch of coastline where the German 15th Army sat idle, waiting for a second invasion that was a complete fabrication of Allied intelligence. This phantom force, known as the 1st United States Army Group, existed only on paper and in the minds of the enemy. But its supposed commander was very real and very dangerous, General George S. Patton. Patton was a man whose reputation preceded him like a thunderclap, a master of mobile armored warfare whose sheer aggression had already dismantled Axis resistance in North Africa and Sicily, making him the only Allied officer the Germans truly feared as a tactical equal. However, Patton was currently a general without an army, benched after his controversial behavior in Sicily, and used as a centerpiece for Operation Fortitude, the grandest deception in the history of warfare. Churchill understood better than anyone that the German leadership, including Field Marshals Gerd von Rundstedt and Erwin Rommel, were psychologically predisposed to believe that Patton would lead the true invasion of Europe. As long as Patton remained in England, the Germans refused to move their heavy panzer divisions from the Pas-de-Calais to Normandy, fearing that doing so would leave the door open for old blood and guts to strike their most vulnerable point. Inside the dimly lit study of 10 Downing Street, Churchill leaned forward, the smoke from his cigar swirling around him like the fog of war he intended to create, and proposed a plan that seemed to defy military logic. He wanted to send Patton to France to lead the very real Third Army, yet he demanded that the world, and specifically the German intelligence apparatus, be led to believe that Patton was still sitting in a camp in Kent. This was the double reverse strategy, an intricate layer of lies where the truth was hidden in plain sight, requiring Patton to win real battles while the enemy dismissed his presence as a clever Allied ruse. Eisenhower looked at Churchill with a mixture of admiration and dread, knowing that managing Patton's explosive ego was difficult enough when he was in the spotlight, but asking him to conquer France in total anonymity was a different challenge entirely. The dilemma was profound, for if the Germans realized the Third Army was real and Patton was at its helm, they would immediately release the massive reserves held at the Pas-de-Calais, potentially overwhelming the fragile Allied beachhead in Normandy. Every day the Germans waited for a second invasion that would never come was a day bought in the blood of Allied soldiers fighting for every inch of French soil. Eisenhower realized that this was not just a matter of logistics or troop movements, but a psychological duel between the Allied command and the German Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, with Patton's name serving as the most potent weapon in their arsenal. He agreed to the Prime Minister's proposal, but he knew the hardest part would be convincing the most headlines-hungry general in American history to disappear into the shadows of his own success. Just like that, the orders were cut, and a veil of absolute secrecy descended over the movements of one of the most recognizable figures in the world, as Patton was instructed to prepare for a deployment that would involve no press, no public announcements, and no glory. To Patton, this was a form of psychological torture, a sentence of professional execution that made him feel like a mere pawn in a game played by politicians and diplomats rather than a warrior on a battlefield. He paced his headquarters in Dover, surrounded by the wooden decoys and inflatable tanks of his ghost army, feeling the bitter irony of being the most famous man in the military while being forbidden from letting the world know he was still alive and active. But the German high command was already falling into the trap, their intelligence reports filled with sightings of Patton's distinctive ivory-handled revolvers in southern England, even as the real general was making clandestine preparations to cross the English Channel. The fog of war was thickest in the halls of the German headquarters at Zossen, where analysts obsessed over every radio transmission and every scrap of disinformation fed to them by the double-cross system of Allied-controlled spies. They were convinced that Patton was the key to the Allied strategy, and their rigid military doctrine dictated that they must hold their best troops in reserve to meet him when he finally made his move across the narrowest part of the channel. Immediately, the logistical miracle of moving an entire army across the sea under this cover of darkness began, as thousands of tanks, trucks, and men belonging to the Third Army were funneled into the Norman ports without a single German scout plane detecting the shift in power. Eisenhower watched the troop manifest with bated breath, knowing that one slip, one leaked photograph, or one ill-timed boast from Patton could bring the entire house of cards crashing down. The pressure was immense, for the Allies were not just fighting the Wehrmacht, they were fighting the clock, trying to build enough strength to break out of the Normandy pocket before the German defenses could solidify into an unbreakable wall. When Patton finally arrived on French soil in early July, he did not come with the roar of a hero's welcome, but with the quiet intensity of a man who had everything to prove and nothing to lose. He stood on the deck of a transport ship, his eyes fixed on the horizon, wearing a plain trench coat to hide his rank in his signature uniform, a visual metaphor for the silent role he was now forced to play. He met with General Omar Bradley, his former subordinate who was now his superior, a dynamic that added yet another layer of tension to an already volatile situation. Bradley reinforced Eisenhower's orders. The Third Army must remain ghostly for as long as possible, its movements masked by the chaos of the front line and the continued deception efforts back in England. Suddenly, the Third Army was activated on the western flank of the Allied line, and Patton unleashed the full fury of his armored divisions, driving them into the Brittany Peninsula with a speed that shocked even his own staff. The tactical execution was flawless, utilizing a doctrine of bypass and surround that saw American columns racing deep into the German rear, cutting communication lines and spreading panic among the retreating defenders. Yet even as Patton's tanks liberated town after town, the official communiques from Allied headquarters spoke only of advances by unidentified units, a deliberate omission that drove Patton to the brink of a nervous breakdown. He screamed at his diary, writing that he was being robbed of his place in history by men who were afraid of his shadow, yet he continued to drive his men forward with a relentless energy that defied the exhaustion of the campaign. The psychological aspect of this leadership cannot be understated. Patton was fighting two wars, one against the German army and one against his own insatiable desire for recognition. Every time he wanted to call a press conference to announce a great victory, he remembered Eisenhower's warning that a single headline could cost 10,000 lives, a sobering reality that served as a tether to his explosive temperament. Meanwhile, across the lines, the German generals were in a state of confused paralysis, receiving reports of American tanks appearing in places they weren't supposed to be, yet refusing to believe that these were part of a major offensive led by Patton. They interpreted the Third Army's lightning-fast movements as a desperate Allied attempt to distract them from the real threat at the Pas de Calais, a testament to the effectiveness of the deception Churchill had championed. They were so convinced of their own intelligence that they began to ignore the reality on the ground, favoring the comfortable lies of their analysts over the desperate reports from their commanders in the field, who were being overrun by Patton's steel columns. This was the action phase of the protocol, where military terminology like envelopment, armored spearheads, and operational tempo became the reality of the French countryside as the Third Army turned the flank of the entire German defense. Patton was in his element. His commands barked over radio sets with a clarity that left no room for hesitation, his presence at the front line acting as a catalyst for his soldiers' bravery. He was a general who led from the front, often standing in his jeep to direct traffic at critical crossroads, his physical presence a direct contradiction to the ghost he was supposed to be in the eyes of the world. Authenticity was found in the radio recordings of the time, where the crackle of static could not hide the urgency in the voices of American tank commanders, reporting that they had reached the sea and cut off the entire Brittany Peninsula in record time. These men did not know they were part of a grand deception. They only knew they were winning, and they were winning under a commander whose name they were forbidden to speak in their letters home. The human cost of this silence was high, as the soldiers of the Third Army felt like the forgotten stepchildren of the invasion, while the fame and glory were heaped upon the units fighting at Caen and Saint-Lô. Eisenhower continued to balance the strategic needs of the alliance with the personal needs of his most volatile commander, sending Patton private letters of praise that served as a meager substitute for the public adulation he craved. He knew that the moment the double reverse was revealed, The German reaction would be swift and violent, and he had to ensure that by the time that happened, the Allies were strong enough to withstand the blow. The tension was like a coiled spring, wound tighter with every mile the Third Army advanced until the sheer scale of Patton's victories made the lie impossible to maintain any longer. The momentum of the Third Army was not merely a physical force of steel and gasoline, but a psychological hurricane that threatened to blow the lid off the most guarded secret in the Allied High Command. By the first week of August, 1944, General George S. Patton had transformed the narrow Avranches Gap into a funnel of destruction, pouring his armored divisions through the breach with a ferocity that left the German 7th Army reeling in a state of total disorientation. Just like that, the double reverse strategy entered its most dangerous phase, as the speed of Patton's advance made it increasingly difficult for Allied censors to maintain the fiction of his presence back in England. While the world's newspapers were filled with vague reports of Allied armored thrusts in the south of Normandy, the men of the Third Army were executing a masterclass in modern maneuver warfare, covering hundreds of miles in a matter of days. Patton himself was a whirlwind of activity, moving his mobile command posts closer to the front lines every hour, often outrunning his own supply lines and communications in his desperate quest for a decisive victory. Immediately, the German High Command found themselves trapped in a cognitive dissonance that would ultimately prove fatal to their defense of France. Field Marshal von Rundstedt received frantic reports from his frontline commanders, describing a highly organized, aggressively led American army that moved with a speed they had only seen from Patton in Sicily. Yet the intelligence officers in Berlin remained adamant that Patton was still in Kent, overseeing the massing of troops for the real invasion at the Pas-de-Calais. This internal conflict within the German leadership led to a paralysis of command, as they refused to commit their vital panzer reserves to stop a general they believed was still 300 miles away. But the psychological toll on Patton was reaching a breaking point, as he felt the heavy hand of Eisenhower's censorship like a gag across his mouth during the greatest triumph of his career. In his private diaries, he recorded his growing resentment, writing that he was winning the war for men who were too afraid to let him speak his own name to the people he was liberating. He saw the French citizens waving flags and cheering his soldiers, yet he knew that in the history books being written at that very moment, his contributions were being buried under a mountain of strategic lies. This despair was not just a matter of ego, it was the frustration of a warrior who believed that the truth of combat was the only thing that mattered in the eyes of God and history. Suddenly, the tactical situation shifted as the Third Army reached the outskirts of Le Mans, and Patton realized he had the opportunity to execute a massive encirclement that could trap the entire German presence in Normandy. He pleaded with General Bradley to allow him to close the trap, but the double reverse deception still required a level of caution that Patton found intolerable. The Allied High Command was terrified that if Patton moved too boldly, the Germans would finally realize the magnitude of the deception and withdraw their forces from the Pas-de-Calais before the Allies were ready to face them. This created a friction between the commanders that threatened to derail the entire breakout, as Patton pushed for total destruction while Eisenhower insisted on maintaining the strategic mask. Every decision made during these critical hours was fraught with ambiguity and the crushing pressure of the fog of war, as commanders on both sides struggled to separate reality from the sophisticated fiction of Operation Fortitude. The German commanders in the field were begging for reinforcements, but Hitler himself intervened, ordering that the divisions at Calais stay put because he was personally convinced that Patton would never be wasted on a sideshow like the Normandy breakout. Hitler's own obsession with Patton's military genius became the very chain that bound the German army to a useless piece of coastline, proving that a well-crafted lie could be more effective than 1,000 heavy bombers. The action on the ground was a whirlwind of military terminology come to life, as Patton's cavalry tradition manifested in the way his armored spearheads bypassed strong points to strike deep into the enemy's soft underbelly. Tanks used their 75mm guns to blast through roadblocks, while infantry mounted on half-tracks cleared the surrounding woods with relentless efficiency. The logistics of this advance were a miracle in themselves, with thousands of trucks of the Red Ball Express racing through the night to keep the Third Army fed with the fuel and ammunition it needed to maintain its blistering pace. Authenticity echoed through the radio transmissions of the time, with German officers describing the American advance as a rolling carpet of fire that they simply could not contain. These recordings capture the genuine terror of men who realized they were being hunted by a ghost, an army that officially did not exist under a commander who was supposedly in another country. The emotional weight of these accounts adds a layer of grim reality to the documentary, showing that behind the high-level strategies of Churchill and Eisenhower were thousands of individual lives being consumed by the machinery of war. By mid-August 1944, the deception had become so successful that it started to create new problems for the Allies, as the rapid collapse of the German front meant that the double reverse was no longer necessary to protect the beachhead. Eisenhower and Churchill met once more to discuss the timing of the big reveal, knowing that the moment they announced Patton's presence, the German strategy would shift from defensive paralysis to a desperate all-out retreat. They decided to wait until the Falaise pocket was fully engaged, ensuring that by the time the Germans realized the truth, their best divisions would already be caught in a terminal enclosure. Just like that, the veil was finally lifted, and the name of George S. Patton exploded across the headlines of the world like a long-suppressed volcano. The announcement was met with a mixture of shock and jubilation, as the public finally understood why the progress in France had suddenly accelerated to such a dizzying speed. For Patton, the moment of revelation was one of immense relief, though it was tempered by the realization that he had already missed the opportunity to capture the largest portion of the German army due to the delays caused by the deception. He immediately held a press conference, his voice thick with emotion as he told reporters that he had been fighting in a closet for 2 months and was finally glad to be out in the sun. But the consequences of the deception were far-reaching, as the German high command felt a deep sense of humiliation at being so thoroughly outmaneuvered by a series of psychological tricks. This humiliation fueled a new level of desperation in their defense of the West Wall, leading to a hardening of resistance that would make the final months of the war some of the bloodiest in history. The double reverse had won the Battle of Normandy and saved countless Allied lives, but it also taught the Germans that they could no longer trust their own intelligence reports, leading to a breakdown in their command structure that would haunt them until the fall of Berlin. Immediately, Patton turned his attention toward the German border, driving his army with even more intensity now that the world was watching his every move. He became a celebrity general, a larger-than-life figure whose ivory-handled revolvers and foul-mouthed speeches became the symbols of American military might. Yet the memory of the double reverse remained a sensitive subject between him and Eisenhower, a reminder of the time when his own government had treated him as a piece of equipment rather than a human being. This tension would continue to define their relationship for the remainder of the war, a clash of two different philosophies of leadership, the diplomatic and the visceral. The thematic core of this narrative is the sacrifice of individual glory for the sake of a collective strategic goal, a concept that is often lost in the heroic retellings of World War II history. Churchill's brilliance lay in his understanding that the mind of the enemy is the most important battlefield, and Eisenhower's skill was in his ability to manage the impossible personalities required to win that battle. Patton, for all his flaws, proved that he was capable of a level of discipline that few had expected of him, setting aside his personal desires for the benefit of the soldiers under his command. The final analysis of the double reverse strategy shows that it was one of the most cost-effective operations of the entire war, using a single man's reputation to paralyze 50,000 German troops for over 60 days. The cause of the Allied victory was not just superior manufacturing or greater numbers, but a superior understanding of the human heart and its capacity for fear and self-deception. The consequences of this victory were the liberation of Western Europe and the destruction of the Nazi regime, a result that justifies every lie told in the dark rooms of London and Dover. As the Third Army rolled toward the Rhine, the shadow of the Ghost Army faded into the background, replaced by the very real and very lethal presence of American steel. The story of Patton, Eisenhower, and Churchill is a testament to the fact that in the crucible of total war, the most powerful weapon is not always the biggest bomb, but the most convincing story. They wove a web of deception that saved a continent, proving that sometimes the only way to see the light of victory is to walk through the fog of war. Now that you know the full extent of the deception, do you think history would remember Patton differently if he had remained a ghost until the very end of the war? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.